be Melinda Rosas. Good morning. Thank you for welcoming us. We're going to talk about corn today. We have been talking and assessing corn since 2018 as part of the Sistema Chacras program, and we will talk about the final seasons. Fernando is an agricultural engineer. He graduated from La Plata University. He also has a postdoc degree, and he's currently working at INTA in Tres Arroyos in the experimental farm. I'm Melina Posas. I am the general coordinator of the corn network of the south of Buenos Aires. Let's see if I can find the pointer. I'd like to tell you that this network is part of the Sistema Chacras program, which was launched because farmers had some needs, and our goal is to meet specific requirements and to develop sustainable technologies. We have an overall comprehensive approach, and we have two main mottos: horizontal involvement and growing by learning. We have several themes as part of our network, and our networks usually cover a wide region, and we have three main elements. Farmers, the ones that carry out the trials and tests, they give us the information we share. Companies that contribute resources, technology, and seeds. And the experts, subject matter experts, in this case Fernando Ross, will tell us about the information we have been gathering throughout the latest seasons. So let's give the floor to Fernando. Good morning. Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here today to talk about the shared work between INTA and Aapresid. And I'm really pleased to talk about all this, about our work at the core network of the south of Buenos Aires, especially talking about late corn, because there are many people here who have participated in the trials. Planting, harvesting, this involves a lot of time, labor, but well, you are the ones who will be benefiting the most from this information. Well, I'm going to talk about the results of the network of the last season. We're talking about the current season. We'll just have some information because this corn is only being harvested now. We haven't completed the harvest. We will look at the results, sometimes using partial information from some seasons, and sometimes using information about all the trials that were carried out by the network. We are talking about different environments and management. Usually talk about management by environment. I'm going to talk about it the other way around, because we have to adjust the management to the environment. But what drives productivity? Well, usually the environment. We are talking about genotypes, environments, the place where we have. So we talk about management. Sometimes it's difficult to talk about the different parts, but we want to talk about the environment, the scenario faced by the crops, and paying attention to the genotypes, which is one of our main focuses. And after that, I'm going to talk about an important metric. In the south of Buenos Aires, corn is a new crop, and to understand how we are positioned from the point of view of yield vis-à-vis other areas, the efficiency in water use is very important, because if we talk about yield per se, it doesn't tell us too much if we don't talk about the amount of water used by the crop. And finally, I'm going to talk about the what is happening with corn as a second crop. Many trials have been carried out since 2018 or 2019, when the network was set up. There are several areas where trials were carried out several years, and in the south of Buenos Aires province, you can see that our network is present everywhere. We have a lot of information, interesting information, and this is important because the range of yields is very wide, and it's important to know how hybrids behave in these different scenarios. I'm going to talk about hybrids. When I talk about hybrids, I will talk about the last season and the current one. Let's start. Let's start by describing the sites, 22-23 season and 23-24 season. Here we have the areas, Bonifacio, Chaco, Guamini, you can see Olavarria, Torkins, and in 23-24 Torkins, Guamini, and Caroline. The previous crops, do you believe this is important information? It is. Why? There is not too much to say about long fallows. Soybean as a second crop, sunflower. The rest of them are short-term fallows. We look at the impact of cover crops in late corn, but this is not the focus of our work. Anyway, it's good to know about this. Changes of different yields in these two seasons. This is information about the current season. This is the area where it rained. The crop used about 500 millimeters, and the yield was ranged between 9,500 and 35,000. Sorry, between 9,500 and 9,900 tons. For many seasons, there was no rainfall in February and March. In this season, there was rainfall, but it didn't make it to the south. If we look at Torkins, there was no rainfall. It has 257 millimeters, and we can see this in the yield. With 150 millimeters of rainfall, you get excellent results. This is the rainfall. If we are above 350 in the region, well, this is the main requirement for have a response to nitrogen and to the technology used. Corn needs water. And when we talk about density, we can see here in some areas close to Olavarria and Cómo, where you have a different density. Well, we will talk about the interactions of this, of all the figures and all the elements. Let's look at the results of the 22-23 season. Here we have the various areas, the hybrids organized from higher to lower. We see the different colors. In green we have the highest ranking ones, in red the lowest ranking ones, and we see the highest, the areas with the highest yield at the top. The area where there is the variety, where there is the highest yield, where we see that yields range from top to bottom, 5,000 kilograms. And if we look at the hybrids, the hybrid that has the best yield has 5,200 kilograms, and the lowest yield is 4,200. So the gap between genotypes is 1,000 kilograms, and the gap between sites or areas is 5,000. So that's why it's important to assess the environment and the relative weight of the genotype vis-a-vis the yield per site. So if you have one hybrid, you don't have to wait too much. You just have to wait for the rainfall. Another interesting issue is that all the hybrids that have the best behavior from the average upwards, usually they are painted green. There are some exceptions. So the network carries out 2 repetitions per area. Sometimes 2 is not enough, and there might be a repeated error in some areas. So when we look at the behavior of a hybrid, take into account different yields. For example, for low yield, I take these through areas, and I should group the average of those 3 areas, looking at the hybrid and the average of these 3 areas. Do you understand what I mean? So that the information is more robust. So instead of having 2 repetitions, I have 6. And that information, that data is more robust. Anyway, we share the information in this way in our reports because you as users need all the information, and each of you will have different conditions. I don't know if you understand what I mean, but please, if you group different areas, well, the information is more robust. Let's look at the 23-24 season. Here is more sort of noise. 9,000, almost 10,000 kilograms in these 2 areas, and 3,600 in Torquist. The gap between areas, there are 4 areas, 4 districts that haven't been included yet in this table. We will include information about these other sites in the final report. When you look at hybrids, the gap among hybrids is where we have 8,400 for the best one and 7,000 for the worst one. So 1,500 kilograms in an average of 7,500. Between 10 and 15%. So this is the weight of the hybrid when this is the importance of hybrids. If we go to the 22-23 season, where we had about 1,000 kilograms in 5,000. Again, 10 to 15%, 15-20%. So, again, here there's more noise, so to say, because Guamini didn't have the same behavior as Car. When we look at the hybrids, we can see that the colors are different. There is some the hybrid 7220 did quite well in Carway, but in Guamini it was 1,000 kilograms below the top one, so there is no correlation here. Anyway, working as when we group the sites, we will have more robust information. We look at Torquist had the lowest yield, and we'll see how this will be grouped later on. Now let's talk about the results. Here we can see the difference in kilograms per hectare among hybrids considering the yield of each site or each area. As the yield increases, what happens with the difference in yield among hybrids? It grows in kilograms per hectare. In absolute terms, the difference grows. However, when we talk about relative figures, And this is the point, we see this, the sites where the yield was lowest, the relative difference between or among hybrids is larger, so the weight of the hybrids is more important where? In those areas where the yield is the lowest. In areas with the highest yield, we are talking about 10 to 12%. If we look at all the networks and look at all the yield in the core area, you will see these differences in yields among hybrids, 10 to 15%, just the same figures we have here. So the data we are getting from the network is data that reliable data coming from reliable trials. So it's good to have a good genotype when my environment when the environment doesn't support such a big yield from the very beginning. So choosing the right hybrid is important. Anyway, there isn't one hybrid which always does best. So it's important to choose hybrids which are quite stable. So
So when we analyze 22, 23, 24 seasons where the yield per crop was low, relatively lousy seasons, 12,500 kilos is not such bad, but the yield per crop was approximately 60,000 crops. So what we see in the statistics is this. The performance of the best hybrids is similar for all yield levels. So the best yield is the best everywhere, and that is the purpose of all the improvers, to have the flexibility and plasticity to perform well in every situation, and that occurs when the crop yield is low. And what we are seeing here is basically the data of traditional corn, that is to say yields below 200 kilos. And this is reflected in many other pieces of information. And other researchers told me, why don't we gather all the information and publish this information? Because the hybrid that performs well is the best. But based on what we discussed before, there is interaction between site and hybrid or genotype. And this is because in the south we have low rate of density management. And when we see this range, 200 grams per crop and lower, this is different compared to when we see broader yields per crop. So this is all the information that we have in the network. 2018, 2019, we are talking about 6 seasons. This is the average of the network based on the density of all the tests. But it's not a regression in this case. It's just having all the information together. And this dotted line is the line that divides tests with more than 200 grams per crop versus those that were below 200 grams. The average of all the data shows that the network that uses the technology used by farmers has an average of 175 grams per crop. So it's part of what we see in the books. We talk about working on low densities or rates in the south, but at the end of the day, the data is not outlying. 65% of the data is or shows below 200 grams per crop. Only 35% of the data show this plasticity condition where the crop performs or has a yield higher than 200 grams. And this is good news, because actually we are not doing something different if we compared what we are doing here versus other regions. This is information published some time ago. We see the crop yield based on the availability of resources per plant or crop, and this is density. The lower the density, the more resources the plant has. The higher density, the lower amount of resources per plant. So when we have more resources per plant, the plant should perform or have a higher yield. We separated plastic hybrids, the dotted line, compared to the full line, which are less plastic hybrids. When we talk about the plasticity of the first spike, which is approximately 185 grams, we have the average of the test, 75 grams per plant, approximately somewhere here. This is optimal yield or the density management described in books. And we said that only 35% of the data is part of the higher plasticity, right? Where the low plasticity hybrids do not generate grain. And why I am saying and showing this? Because it's important to see yield per plant. If I go back to the spreadsheet and I don't know the yield per plant in each site, and you are thinking about very low density, but at the end of the day, the information is showing you that you are having the standard type of density. So in that case, you should go back to the spreadsheet. I don't want to show you some pre-reviewed analysis, because each of you works in different conditions. But you should go back to the spreadsheet and check the report for this year and to characterize every site with this yield per plant per region. Now let's talk about hydric or water resources and the rainfall for each crop and the performance of the crop. So we have information from the network. We have most of the rainfall. We have yield per rainfall and sowing, approximately 125 days after the sowing or the seeding. This is not perspiration water, but it's more or less the same. What happens in our area, the water balance is the rain, all the rain is used by the crop, and the ratio between perspiration and evaporation has to do with, well, each parcel. That is to say, the storage capability, the coverage of the parcel. The more coverage, I will lose less water by evaporation, and I can't show all these equations because there are many other variants and I don't have the physical information here. But this is the result. And what we can see in this chart is that, based on the network information, we are not very efficient when the rainfall level is very high. Why we are not performing that well with heavy rains? Because our production model is not designed for that. Sometimes we have heavy rains, we perform well, but we could have done better. So what can we do to perform better? So if we go back to the literature, this is a study in Balcarce. We have the grain yield based on with hydric balance, and what it says is basically the same. There are two conditions here. the dotted symbols, the full symbols show water availability and nitrogen. The empty symbols are lack of water availability without nitrogen. That is to say, nitrogen coming from the soil. So as we have more water available, the nitrogen response increases. So probably this is what is happening now. However, when we see yields below 6,000 kilos, we observe that the performance of level is not that important. The corn is a green seed, and we should consider the level of nitrogen in the soil. But this doesn't mean that if the yield is below 6,000, the nitrogen is not used. No, that is not the case. Anyway, what you can see here, there are certain levels or efficiency levels for water use that show 14 to 23 kilos per millimeter. So if I have more water, I need to have nitrogen to get to the 23 kilograms per millimeter. Otherwise, I won't achieve that level. In the network, where we have the nitrogen efficiency rates in all the sites. In the south of Buenos Aires, there are certain sites that show similar performance as in potential irrigation conditions. So this shows that many sites have a use of water higher than 17, and that is very good. But all the other dots, 6 or 7 outliers, need to go above the line. Sometimes we can do it, sometimes we can't. For example, 9.7, as you can see here, is a test performed in Huamini. It was presented in UPA last year for the past season. The crop was great. We had 2 spikes. It was a cornfield that was beautiful. The years in February there were no rains, as well as in March, and the cornfield for 10,000 kilos ended with a yield of less than 4 kilos. And water was during the critical period, but it didn't have to fill the grain. The critical period is during the flowering. It is very important to get water during the flowering to have more grains and for plasticity to trigger a second year. But if it doesn't rain, and I think that there were high temperatures also in March, so if there was no irrigation, the performance was very low, and the only possibility to increase the yield was by having water or irrigation. So if the balance between perspiration, which is the water that goes to the grain, and to have minimum water evaporation in the soil, these dots will be above the line. However, the average of the data shows that in the south they are doing things correctly. For the water that they are receiving, the yield of the corn is okay. And perhaps that is not the case for soybean. I don't have the information for soybean, but so this is very important when we talk about the crops in the south. And this is the water analysis. So this is use efficiency of water based on plant yield. Low yield is here, approximately 200 grams per plant, and lower, and 200 grams above are strategies for low density. So what do we see here? So there is a good efficiency of water use. Does that tell you anything? Well, we have to make the best use of this. So we see some dispersion here. When we talk about low yield per plant, we see that the spreading is very significant. But when we talk about high yield per plant testing, we see that the use of water is more stable and therefore more efficient. So late sowing date represents the stability of the crop. If we have a late sowing for corn, the outcome is not going to be very good. But if we sow late, we get stability. And when we reduce the density, we accomplish the same stability in the use of water. This has to be supported by hybrid plasticity, of course. So we can see in this chart that when we use low yield per plant strategy, that is to say high plasticity, we have instability. But what happens when we have a low yield per plant? We see the other piece of information that is closer to potential corn information, that is to say a potential scenario with no deficiencies. So if we want to have excellent corn yields, we need low yield per density. We need to reduce the density, because that produces a good use of water when we talk about low density. However, the variability that we see here is useless. I don't know, because I don't know if you are understanding what I'm saying.
Well, this information is key. Here we have the two elements. The maximum efficiency, we achieve it with a high density. And here we have lots of stability. And here there are some dots, some data points, and this happens once in a while, is when the environment reduces reproductive plasticity, and in our environments we find a large response to density. When do we have this? When reproductive plasticity takes place, when there is vegetative stress, especially when the fallow is not good, when water was not stored on another crop was very close. Here, the plasticity is not triggered. To have plasticity, we need early growth, early nutrition, early water. So if we want to have this triggered, if we want to stop another process, we have to remove all that. So when we measure this early on, you don't see too much, but for me it's very interesting. This is an average in water use efficiency. Let's talk about corn as a second crop. This is a result from, these are the results from the 22-23 seasons, the difference in yield among different areas and the difference in yield among hybrids, and the hybrid that has the highest yield and the one that has the lowest yield, the difference is only 10%, 400 kilograms difference, whereas the average difference among scenarios is larger. Here we see the impact of frosts, and this doesn't happen with the cycle length in late planting. In corn as a second crop, this interaction is larger, and we see that this hybrid that did very well has, in 3 areas it did very well, and it also, but it drops in other areas. So in this season, where we had the same results, just what we saw with late corn areas where there was rainfall. Corn as a second crop had very good yields, and the areas where there was no rainfall, turkeys and tres arroyos, the yields are much lower. Here, I'd like to stress that we are facing a challenging year for corn as a second crop. It's actually good to have many hybrids in the trials network because of the area of the issue of the grasshopper. Last year there was this problem of the grasshopper. Last year it's very good to have it as part of the network to know about the behavior of the hybrids, because this is a very we're talking about leaf hopper here, not grasshopper. Maybe in this season we will have no issues because the winter was quite cold. The network, the monitoring network for leaf hopper is showing that there was a decrease in this pest. Anyway, it's warm in the north again, so we have to see what the pest cycle is, not this year, but global warming is a problem, climate change is a problem, and as a result of climate change, we are being able to plant corn as a second crop in our region. The autumn is much longer, we don't have early frosts, so we have time to plant corn, so we should have a close look at what happens with leaf hopper. Let's hope this was just 1 year. We have just talked about the results of the late corn network, of the corn as a second crop network, the different results in the various areas, the interaction between management and environment, and we have also talked about yield per plant, stress tolerance, which is very similar to what is found in the literature, and the point I have also talked about reproductive plasticity. We need more information here anyway. And the efficiency in water use, and this is very important for corn crops in the southern region. Thank you very much, and let's open the floor to questions. Thank you, Fernando. Thank you to those who have shared information about the current season. And I have received some questions about density. As this, in the south of Buenos Aires, there are many different environments, different soils too, and we talk about reproductive stability of the hybrids. So, if you choose a given hybrid, should you change the density too? Very good question, a difficult question to answer. Well, in the graph I've shown you that some hybrids, if we give them lots of resources, if we reduce the density, they may have a higher yield. In the density networks of Aapresid, this is clear. This shows us there is very limited response to density in almost all environments in the south. However, if this is a replacement for the variable density requirements in our plots, we usually have environments where there is high productivity and others where there is a low productivity. As the average densities are high, well, if we use hybrids with a lower density, or if our management goal is to move towards higher densities, that variable density requirement will be present. I personally believe that it's more necessary to introduce changes in nutrition rather planning plant density. Anyway, the plasticity of hybrids is limited, and sometimes it doesn't take place, but sometimes in those cases when we increase the density, we increase yield. And of course, this depends on the plot, on the variability of the plot, but variability in fertilization is a key requirement, especially talking about nitrogen and density. Well, it's important. Anyway, we should analyze this on a case-by-case basis. And if you talk about nutrition, would like to tell you that since 2018 we have been working in fertilization in our network. There are dissertations being written about this, and we are sharing this information on the social media. And we also have a question about biologicals in corn in the south of Buenos Aires. This is a highly discussed theme. Well, but actually we haven't used those inputs yet, but I believe this is an theme we should look into in the future. So to be able to use these inputs, I have no expertise. I'm not an expert in biologicals. I'm saying this was to give you some warning. Biologicals, well, when I see them, I understand that the plasticity, having reproductive plasticity expressed, means that in the early development of the plant, the functional processes, the number of grains per tassel, that is having a plant that is as strong and robust as possible. If with biologicals we get better early growth, this would be expert. I know some biologicals are sort of the silver bullet, but I don't think the biologicals can take the place of pure fertilization. Maybe something may help us to increase nitrogen uptake, but nitrogen has to be there anyway. If we were talking about soybean, where we have a symbiosis, where the biologicals give everything the plant needs, this would be great. We would be fully green because we would have a very limited carbon footprint. If we stopped using urea, our footprint would be much smaller, but the response to nitrogen is great. But when there is no nitrogen in corn, the yields are very low. Biologicals are great, but they are not. But don't think that biologicals will take the place of fertilization. But I don't know too much about this yet. Well, I believe this will be an area in which the network will focus in the future. So we're running out of time. So I'd like to make some announcements. For future talks, well, you will find a QR code, and you may use it to send your questions, to submit your questions. And when the harvest season is over, we will share a report with all the results of the network, talking about late corn and corn as a second crop. And you will be able to find this information through the Aapresid website. And in the meantime, I'd like to tell you there is a new area where you will be able to see the information on harvest per site, so you won't have to wait for a final report. And finally, at 10:45, the Sistema Chakras program has in the hall of the Volkswagen room, there is a posters presentation where all the stakeholders are participating, universities, INTA, etc. So I'd like to invite you to visit the posters exhibition. Thank you very much for having participated in this speak.